Next up in my series, taking a look at all 32 NFL teams and the 5 greatest players in the history of each organization in the NFL, I look at the Atlanta Falcons, an organization that frankly doesn't have a long storied history or tradition, doesn't have an incredibly long history as it is, only being in the league since 1966, but by and large, that history has not been all that particularly good. You've had a flash here, a flash there of some good things. But in general, the Falcons have been a relatively snake bitten franchise since they first came into the league. Not a single Super Bowl championship, only one NFC championship, and that, of course, was the 1998 season. And when I was putting together this list for the 5 greatest players, I'm like, ooh, this is one of the weakest lists of any organization in the NFL. It really was. There's only one Hall of Famer on the list, a couple other guys that maybe deserve some consideration. Actually, there's two. I'll take that back. There's two of them. But in general, just not a lot of Hall of Famers, not a lot of multiple time All Pros, not a lot of truly great players in the history of the Atlanta Falcons organization since 1966, and that's the truth of the matter. It actually wasn't that incredibly hard for me to put together this Falcons list, though, because I thought it had a very clear hierarchy of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I maybe struggled a little bit with numbers 4 and 5 and which order they should be in, those two players, but that was about it. In terms of some honorable mentions, some guys of note that missed the list, guys like Jeff Van Note, Steve Bartkowski, in particular William Andrews, 3 guys that have had their jersey numbers retired by the organization. William Andrews was really close to making the list, as was somebody like a Roddy White. I think someday, obviously, a Matt Ryan will be on this list. I don't think Michael Vick deserves to not be mentioned here as one of those great Falcon players during his time. I also look at guys like Gerald Riggs and guys like Jesse Tuggle. These are guys that I think at least deserve some type of mention in terms of their level of play as Atlanta Falcons. But ultimately, we're here to determine the 5 greatest Atlanta Falcons of all time, and that's exactly what I attempt to do today. So let's get started. Again, the countdown will be 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I am only solely looking at what that player did during his time with that organization. I am not factoring in the entire career if they spent a good portion of their career not with the organization or what they did with other teams, because that doesn't matter. It's about the greatest players in the history of this specific organization. And I bring that up because number 5, I'm sure, will bring up some debate, and that is Deion Sanders, who spent a total of 5 seasons in Atlanta, 5 seasons from 1989 to 1993. And they were notable seasons, no question about it. They were some really damn good seasons. After being the 5th overall pick out of Florida State in that great top 5, minus Tony Mandridge in the '89 draft, all Deion Sanders did was come in to really take the league by storm, and really bring some life and energy to the league as a 3-time Pro Bowler, a 2-time All-Pro. But really, during his time in Atlanta was where he was really starting to establish himself as a premier defensive player, and in particular as the premier shutdown cover corner in all of the National Football League. I think at the end of the day that a lot of NFL fans, a lot of people in general, think of Deion Sanders maybe more so for his time in Dallas. And you also look at it too, as great as Deion Sanders was, during his time in Atlanta, he was still trying to play baseball. And maybe if he would have been focused solely on football and football alone and spending his year-round preparation solely on football, how much better he could have been during this time. As a result, he was a great player, one of the all-time great defensive players, maybe arguably the greatest shutdown cover corner in NFL history, yes. But in terms of impact and importance and greatness for the Atlanta Falcons organization, he only ranks number 5 on my list. Sorry, primetime fans. Number 4 is Bill Fralick, the 2nd overall pick in the 1985 draft out of Pittsburgh. Some wrestling fans may know him for his appearance in the 20-man Battle Royal at WrestleMania 2, which main evented at the Rosemont Horizon. But he was known by football fans, especially Falcon fans in the mid to late 80s and the early 90s, as a great interior blocker. You're talking about a 4-time Pro Bowler, a 2-time first-team All-Pro, who ended up being a member of the 1980s NFL All-Decade team. He was known as one of the best all-around interior blockers of his time, and perhaps known as the most ferocious and intense interior run blocker, if not offensive line run blocker period in all of the National Football League. He played a total of 8 seasons in Atlanta, 4 of them as a Pro Bowler, 2 of those 4 seasons as a first-team All-Pro. And like I said, he was thought of well enough with only actually having played 5 years in the 1980s. This is important. He was named to the 1980s NFL All-Decade Team. Number 3, the greatest offensive lineman in the history of the Atlanta Falcons, and I think really is criminally underrated, and frankly, I think deserves just a little bit of Hall of Fame consideration, and that is Mike Ken, the left tackle, who was the 13th overall pick out of Michigan in the 1978 NFL Draft. Here was a guy that was solid for so many years, 17 seasons playing primarily left tackle for the Atlanta Falcons, 251 career starts at left tackle, the most starts and games played by any Falcon in team history. The fact that guys like Steve Bartkowski and Jeff Van Note have their jersey retired, but a Mike Ken does not, astounds me and stuns me still to this day. He was somebody that I grew up watching and, again, was just a very solid player. While people with those Falcons teams of the late 80s and early 90s were focused on the Deion Sanders of the worlds and the Andre Risons of the worlds and, great flamboyant players during that time, to me, I would sit there and I would watch a Mike Ken and I'm like, my God, this is a really good player. This is a really good, solid, all-around left tackle. Again, a 5-time Pro Bowler, 2-time first-team All-Pro, most career starts and games played in Atlanta Falcons history, 251 career starts in a 17-year career at left tackle. Think about in today's NFL, where most players are lucky to play 8 to 10 years at a very high level. This is a Mike Ken who played at a very good to high level for 17 seasons. Number 2, some Falcon fans, especially older Falcon fans, may argue with me and say that he is number 1, that he maybe is Mr. Atlanta Falcon, because in large part you could argue that he is. He was the first ever draft choice by the organization in their first year of existence as an expansion franchise in 1966. The first overall pick out of Texas, Tommy Nobis, the great middle linebacker, who during his career was a 5-time Pro Bowler, a 1-time first-team All-Pro. Like I said, again, the first ever draft choice of the Atlanta Falcons, really the first franchise piece. He was the piece that the entire team was supposed to be built around. Now, by and large, the team wasn't built very well around him, but how is that really necessarily to be Tommy Nobis's blame? And another thing that really hurts Tommy Nobis in terms of recognition, in terms of the Pro Bowl appearances and the All-Pro appearances and etc., you have to keep in mind the times that he played in. 66 to 76, 11 seasons manning the middle of the defense for the Atlanta Falcons. He wasn't there for that 77 defense, that grits blitz defense that allowed 9.2 points per game. And during his time, especially during his peak years at the first part of his career, he had guys like Ray Nitschke manning the middle for the Green Bay Packers in his same conference, and he also had a guy by the name of Dick Butkus playing middle linebacker for the Chicago Bears. Those two guys were getting most of the attention. They were getting all of the press. They were getting all of the admiration and love from the fans and from the media, and a guy like Tommy Nobis was kind of left by the wayside. He was underrated and still to this day is very underrated, and I think a player that definitely deserves consideration for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. 5-time Pro Bowler in an era where it was incredibly tough for him to make the Pro Bowl with guys like Butkus in his same conference. A 1-time first-team All-Pro. The Atlanta Falcons player of Atlanta Falcons player, some may argue, being the first ever draft choice and, playing 11 years and being a very solid, productive player, and one of the few reasons in the early years of the Atlanta Falcons to even watch him. But to me, the number 1 player in the history of the Atlanta Falcons, the greatest Atlanta Falcon of them all, is a guy that just recently gained induction as part of the 2014 Pro Football Hall of Fame class, and that is Claude Humphrey, the defensive end out of Tennessee State, the Falcons' 3rd overall selection in the 1968 draft. The funny thing is, early on in the Falcons' draft history, 2 of their first 3 years, they hit home runs with the defensive players that they took. Tommy Nobis in 66, number 1 overall out of Texas. And then in 68, third overall pick out of Tennessee State, a small school that you may know for producing somebody like a Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie, a Claude Humphrey, defensive end, who went on in his 11 seasons to become a six-time Pro Bowler in Atlanta. 11 seasons in Atlanta, 6 times a Pro Bowler, 2 times a first-team All-Pro. He was a key part, in my opinion, of that 77 Grits Blitz defense that allowed an NFL record of only 9.2 points per game in a 14-game season. An outstanding defensive performance that year that often gets left out when people talk about all-time greatest defenses and single greatest seasons by a defense. They allowed 9.2 points per game. And here's a Claude Humphrey that was solid for so many years in Atlanta, one of the best at his position for so many years, maybe in part because he wasn't a part of a great organization or a championship winning or contending team. He, like Tommy Nobis, really went under the radar as some of these other Falcon players did. But I think Claude Humphrey, when you're looking at the fact that he is the only primarily Atlanta Falcon to be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, I think at the end of the day, that makes him the greatest Atlanta Falcon in organization history. Falcon fans, let me know what you think of my list. Football fans in general, let me know what you think of my list. Next up, I will be talking about the Baltimore Ravens, which was a very easy top 5 list for me to do, I assure you.